Greetings and welcome to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. I am John Gulliver and I will introduce the seminar series and our speaker. This series of seminars is co-sponsored by the Water Resources Center and the St. Anthony Falls Laboratory, both at the University of Minnesota. The funding for the seminar series comes from the Minnesota Stormwater Research Council. Our speaker today is Dr. Chin-Win Chang, the program head and Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture, Urban Design, and Environmental Design at Arizona State University. Chin-Win received a PhD in Regional Planning from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Michigan, and a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture and Landscape Architecture from the National Taiwan University. Dr. Chang directs the Hydro GI Lab and co-develops green infrastructure design, research, and practice with stakeholders and communities for sustainable and resilient urban water systems that consider aspects of environmental justice. Her climate justice design methods integrate hydrological modeling, field experiments, and spatial analyses in participatory, transdisciplinary processes to measure landscape performance and social impacts for sustainable development. A licensed landscape architect and lead accredited professional, Dr. Chang is a research fellow of the Landscape Architecture Foundation Case Study Investigation and is research personnel for the Central Arizona Phoenix Long-Term Ecological Research Project and collaborator in the City as Lab Research Coordination Network, both funded by the National Science Foundation. Today, Chin-Win will be discussing some of the nature-based solutions that she has been working on to address societal challenges. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Chin-Win Chang.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, John. And thanks for the invitation to this Minnesota Stormwater Seminar. I'm very honored to be here. And to start with the presentation, when we talk about sustainable, resilient, just environments, I want to start with a link acknowledgement where I'm at right now at Arizona State University. So it is home for 22 federal recognized tribes in Arizona. So when we want to think about creating sustainable future and just futures, I think this is just the first step to acknowledge the past and how we move forward. And in the background, you see how this is our campus, and this Orange Mall project was documented and in the Landscape Architecture Foundation, I received the funding for documenting its performance. And this is the Hydro GI Lab, one of the projects we have conducted. And our lab really intended to understand how those nature-based solutions, green infrastructure worked, and in the social ecological processes and outcomes. And I want to emphasize that process is important. And this project was the first sustainable science initiative, gold certified on our campus. And when we talk about urban water resilience, we know there are many challenges. There can be too much water, too little water. And even you think in Arizona, we only have about 9 inches of rain average, but we do have floods when we have monsoon season and we have uncertainty in those precipitation. And we also have issues on the water quality and also associated with environmental justice. In the Navajo nations, the Four Corners used to have many thousands of Ukrainian mining, and there was spilling and caused environmental degradation and water quality and community health issues. And there is challenges on governance. And there are so many so many parts in the governance. Just highlight this one when I was doing my research on the urban flooding issues and records in the Phoenix area. And interesting, I found, even though our precipitation probably did not vary as much or not abnormally high, but the recorded flooding actually substantially increased in the last decade. And it actually was due to, there was a storm tracer group started, and they started to record more of flooding hazards. And so they can be point out there's governance in terms of how perceived exposure and actual risk could have the gap, and that can have implications on planning and design. And there are challenges on climate justice. So my work also have integrates the social, ecological, technological vulnerability assessments. And in this case, I apply to the entire states, United States, to see whether there are patterns exist, looking at social vulnerability to hazard, looking at the numbers of hazards related to climate change recorded, and whether there is access to green infrastructure. In this case, is land cover to be able to make nature-based solutions to adapt to the change. So this kind of highlighted, not only the cities that could be vulnerable to be climate injustice, there are rural communities also can be exposed to those hazards, and also they could be socially vulnerable. And there are challenges also how we design our infrastructure. The other paper, we discovered the fluvial flooding in the cities, and which refers to the urban flooding that's due to the failure of infrastructure capacity. And we compared, of course, a couple cities in the US, and we discovered that many cities, as we know, we do stormwater design, we based on the rational methods and the past climate data, coefficient data, and those data could be outdated and will not be able to cope with the current pressing climate change on the precipitation patterns. So in this graph, we kind of identify that what we consider as 10-year storm event we designed in the past, and with the future climate scenarios, it will actually exceeding the designed capacity. So now, all the challenges and what would be the solutions. And in the recent decade, this term, nature-based solutions, just became popular. But what we have been doing on the stormwater, on-site stormwater management, green infrastructure, green belts, greenways. I mean, even we can trace back to, the Olmsted's Central Park design as one of the solutions bringing the nature to the city, for hundreds, 200 years. But I do want to mention this term because I think they are now becoming popular and with a lot of policy implication in there too. So it is defined as, how using the ecological design and to address societal issues. That's kind of essential, how this term is being used, particularly to think about climate change and how we build the resilience of the cities and economy. And it's intrinsic, it's transdisciplinary, and it has multiple benefits. However, there are kind of debates on how do we assess those benefits. But today I want to emphasize more on how this investment is being implemented, right? It has become a policy agenda in Europe and the US, and it has been implemented in many cases in landscape architecture design, in building a more resilient cities, address stormwater issues, urban heat island effects, food security, energy security, etc. And now it has been a distinct scholar field because there's even a journal dedicated to it. However, I want to question whether such investment has addressed environmental justice and whether those investment has perpetuated systemic injustice. As we have seen cases like green gentrifications for years, and criticism like this Highline project in New York. And so we have to really think deeply, how can those investments in the nature-based solutions can remedy the past injustice and promote justice futures with community. So since I talk about systemic injustice, I want to define and give a little context, what I mean by that. So as we know the history, looking back, this systemic injustice happened through colonization, and this happened not only in the US, it's all over the world. But that connecting to the land acknowledgement in the beginning, I think we do have to recognize those traumas, those harms done in the past still continue to affect the community today. And the same thing as we have done for our land use and zoning in the past and the housing policies of those redlining practices and the segregation zoning that already contribute to the disinvestment and inequitable investments among different neighborhoods and in many cities in the US. And that also related to the environmental justice. So because of those political, socioeconomic contexts, created this risk society for the communities. So it is a socially constructed risk for the community and populations. And it can be amplified, or it could be attenuated with interventions and to have social-ecological impacts. And the environmental justice in the past has been, the classical study has been looking at the proximity of hazard waste and disposal to the neighborhood, especially minority neighborhoods. And the first kind of systemic study done was in 1987, and it's kind of documenting that spatial pattern of environmental justice. And 20 years later, after that report, Dr. Mohai with other scholars did the same methodology and look at the pattern again. And still they found the minority neighborhoods still live in close proximity to those hazardous, toxic waste and hazardous sites. But 20 years later, what they found though, not only Black communities, who was the kind of primary victims in the past, now the Hispanic and Latino communities are also one of the major minority and exposed to environmental justice issues. So my postdoctoral work at the University of Michigan with Dr. Paul Mohai and Byung-Soo Kwon, we studied how air pollution correlated with school children performance. And how this is done quickly is we spatially identify the schools, the air pollution, and then to use spatial analysis to look at how closely those schools are in proximity to those toxic concentrations, which has numerous cancers risk, etc. And then we look at the school performance data and to correlate how other disadvantaged students, also minority students, are studying in those schools in proximity to those high concentration of air pollution, and then how it relates to their study performance on the reading and the math. And with the statistical analysis finding there are significance between those school children's performance in relation to air pollution. And I only want to pin this picture to really emphasize the importance of our environment. And there is already study saying that your zip code matters more than your genetic code. And the CDC also identify what it calls termed as social determinants of health. So there are many other factors, and you think about all this also will affect the wealth, the health affect wealth, and also generational inequity. So it is important to look at our environment and the environmental design, and recognize how the systems designed in the past continues today to perpetuate inequity and in our environment and communities. So my position today is hoping to introduce the climate justice design in these three components: the nature-based solution, climate justice, and community-based design, and in a hope to create a more sustainable, resilient, and just futures. And while design is to solve problems, but we have wicked problems that we always solving and resolving. And my work has been focusing on waters, so I'll use that as examples. And within this context, we need to think about what is sustainable cities or futures. We always look at the 3 E's, right? Environment, equity, and the economy. And this is a strong sustainability thinking environment is our foundation. And then that we built upon our environment of our community should be equitable, and our economy is what we created upon all the community and the environment together. And all the systems are interlinked in the social, ecological, and technological systems. And we have 2 really major social ecological drivers, I will argue. One is climate change, and another is systemic injustice. So I look at the intersections between resilience, justice, vulnerability, and community, those concepts, and how they interlinked. And one work I collaborated with the Urban Resilience to Extreme Network, and we look at using this SASS framework to assess urban flooding issues. So the idea of vulnerability assessment of exposure, adaptive capacity, and sensitivity, we further look into how each of social, ecological, and technological systems is contributing to the overall vulnerability of urban flooding. So that intersection, the interconnectedness between these 3 systems are the key kind of framework and findings we are getting at from this paper. And we use 6 different cities to illustrate how social vulnerability, technological, and ecological vulnerability come together, and in particularly the intersection between those systems. That will be usually what we overlooked, because when we do planning design, we sometimes may only look at one aspect, but not looking at all 3 systems together. And what's important about this is when we are thinking about interventions on social agenda or ecological restoration or technological intervention, there are places probably it's important to really look at all three of components together. And my work also have been looking at hydrological modeling and climate change impacts on the hydrology. And this work on the Charles River watershed, it's really try to understand what's the climate change on the precipitation intensity and frequency will affect flooding hazards. And then also how we implement stormwater management practices could potentially mitigate those flooding and help the community to adapt. So with this study design, I was able to apply about 3% of land for detention, and it was able to mitigate a little bit flooding, but it's not completely being effective to be narrowing down to the baseline level. So this is important to think about. There is systemic design has to be taken into consideration as we are thinking about the uncertainties in those climate change impacts. And again, those single intervention could have effective measures, but it is the system solution that we are needed today to really have a more holistic approach to address those pressing issues. The other component is to engage with stakeholders and the community together. In this paper, we work with Harvard Forest and this New England's Scenario Service of Society, RCN group. And we developed 4 different land use scenarios and modeling how its impact of urbanization and the hydrology. And I think it is important for the stakeholders and community to understand that the intersection between climate change impact and urbanization impact, so that they could prioritize how they might want to develop those different strategies to address those issues. And so again, my research really tried to highlight those vulnerable areas and how we can think about how applying nature-based solutions could have more equitable outcomes. And in the case in Boston, where we also developed different scenarios with stakeholders, and then we further assess. At that time, Boston want to have planting 100 million trees program. And then we want to know where would that tree be located and to be equitable. So this study, we assessed using the Gini coefficient and understand the available land with each scenarios that we can plant trees and how much of shade and in relation to the income level to see if those are equitably distributed. And in the other project, I look at the Huron River watershed, and with, again, this climate justice scape, looking at climate change impact, social vulnerability, and access to the green infrastructure. But further, I want to understand the risk communication part, right? How we talk to people about risk and whether communication of risk will influence their perceived risk. And so we did a survey, and based on the previous data, we showed in the survey kind of and ask their perceived exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and to see whether their perception changed based on the information. And we also compare the cities we identify as climate justice cities, and compare with non-climate justice cities. And so what we discovered in terms of the perceived exposure, if they will think they will be more vulnerable to future flooding hazards, the climate justice group actually perceived less in this case. It's not as what we hypothesized. And then whether they perceive the sensitivity to the hazards, and it is positively kind of meeting our hypothesis. And then whether the climate justice group will perceive more if they have more capacity to adapt. In this case, it's actually both groups think they have less prepared for their adaptive capacity. So in this paper, I think we argue that we discover actually there is a gap between what people perceive they are the risk and what is actually projected their exposure with. And that gap, I think, has a critical implication in planning and policy of how we communicate, how we can prioritize areas and talk with community for them to understand and to get their buy-ins. So now I will talk more cases on the more practice side of it, how we co-design with communities. And I will use the projects I have done with our students in our studios. And the first project is in South Phoenix, and we work with the Paideia Academy. It's a charter school in the south side of Phoenix. And this area, South Phoenix, has been a red line zone in the past. So there's a historical segregation in the past. And so the students who enrolled in this charter schools are, more than 80% minority and economically distressed. And plus this area, because it's lack of green infrastructure and has a large area of impervious impervious. So it has exposed to the urban heat island impacts. And as many other schoolyards, they have a lot of paving and very hot. And in addition, they have flooding issues from the South Mountain. So what we came in is we work with the students, the parents and faculty, and to come together first to listen. We do a little exercise and just want them to tell us what they want to have for their school. And then we took those information back to studio and developed 3 different scenarios and back to the community again. And now this time they can kind of tell us which feature they like. And so we gather those information and back to studio again, and to develop our final plan that integrates those on-site stormwater management, native plants, reduce imperviousness, and they really try to also make the stormwater management visible, right? We want to make those invisible visible to as part of education. And we also calculated a few co-benefits like carbon sequestration, etc. And in this project, we actually entered the 2019 EPA Campus Rainworks Challenge and won the 2nd place for the site demonstration project. And the student also entered and won the 2020 Arizona chapter of ASOA Student Awards. And what's even more exciting is the founder of the school, does not just hold those conceptual plan on the shelf. He actually wants to implement it. So luckily, students are able to see some of their ideas being implemented, and this is one of the parts is becoming a garden, community garden, and has a fish pond in there, and it really show, especially during COVID, students are able to work outside and eat outside from the plants they grow. And then last summer, the construction started for the rest of the campus. And so you can see before and after. And what is even more amazing is when it rains, it does function as it is designed, and it did not flood the campus. And also the students, this is just last month, the students really enjoy the landscape and play with it. And they really, one of the ideas is how we can create a more natural play for the school campus. And I want to acknowledge this our project for this campus actually it's one part of a larger research agenda that is also working with Paideia School together. And there are many scholars looking at educational outcomes, looking at air quality measurement, etc. A second case study I want to mention is about decolonization design with Hawaii. And we are fortunate that we have 1 year long project with the Honolulu and with a couple of different stakeholders to study the watershed. And what we have learned, really humble to learn from the community, is first understand how they manage their watershed from indigenous knowledge. It's called Ahupuaha, and how the native Hawaiians see the watershed. Each watershed is its own sustainable unit, and they don't trade water with different watersheds, and they really try to sustain the community. So from upstream to downstream, upstream is a conservation, and in the middle is a taro farms, and in the downstream outfall is a fish pond. So it is a very self-sustaining system in thousands of years, probably until the colonization process came in and how the capitalism took over the ecosystems. And so students did the research and drew this timeline of how the native population declined over time, and then all these indigenous practices decreased over time, while the pollutions and tourism increases over time. And you will be probably surprised to hear that over 90% of food in Hawaii is imported from the US and other places. So it's not a very sustainable of Hawaii. So there are many other issues, water quality and water quantity, like flooding, exposure as well. And there's landslides, and there's vulnerable populations on the downstream. So our students developed this plan with multiple ideas. And one of the key one we call the waterhood idea. So when we think about neighborhoods, right, it's a community, we think about your neighbors, the people you kind of hang out with, or how you define your community. But what if we think about water as those unifying system of how communities can come together and work together? So that's the idea of waterhoods. And in addition to other kind of adaptive stormwater design, we entered the national Make Alawai Awesome competition in 2017 and won the first prize. And also this work also being highlighted as award excellence in the Hawaii chapter of ASOA. And what's interesting we discovered there was, so the Alawai, this project, actually the Army Corps engineer have been working on this for decades, probably over 20 years. They have public engagement, report, etc. And then just really when the year we were there, 2017, 16, and there was a funding available come to Hawaii and for them to actually start doing some implementation. But that's when the outcry, the protest from the community started. They want to stop this project. The Army Corps engineering proposed like a 5 feet high seawall because they want to address climate change and other issues of acquire land for detention upstream, but it was on a private property, etc. So there are many things that the Army Corps proposed was really being protested by the community. And so we took one park as kind of one example of how should we engage, co-design with the community. And we work with the local stakeholders, Hawaiian Green Growers and the Blue Zone Project. So this is our process of the studio. So we came in first is to listen, to understand the place. And then we did our homework. And then we came in without any design ideas. And we show this is our understanding of place, and we come to listen and learn from the community and ask the community, tell us more, what we overlooked, what issues they have, and there's some of what they, like their memories of the park and how do they want to see the park to be used. So, so there's a lot of listening pieces. And then we bring that to the community, bring back to the studio and to develop different scenarios. And we come back again and to have another, a series of what we call pop-up workshop. And to really, again, learn from community and get their inputs. And instead of having just one single public meeting, we actually went to different places that are close to community, like the libraries, the coffee shop, and this is the most popular, the shaved ice shop, and then the park itself. So we went to all these different places, and there are multiple different groups of community come to take a look and give us feedback. And then again, we can kind of collect those information and develop final scenarios that help to address those issues that the community cares about. One is the water, the ecosystems of the site, and the climate, how we adapt to climate change, and then to provide the different uses. There are also a houseless community there, they are concerned. And so how we can design a more inclusive park for all. And in that process, we learned the most. One is we have to think about all the decisions we are making, right? We have to think about long-term. So if we are the ancestors in the making, what kind of ancestors do we want to be? So that will be upon ourselves, each of our individual, to collective decisions. So with this project, we learned first is we should connect before collaborate. So that the first workshop, we did not bring any design ideas, and which is a very wise decision. And actually, the community came to us and said, we never had this kind of community engagement before. And even we know there were some Native Hawaiian who were really did not feel comfortable in the first about this process because they were really, suspicious about whether we are coming in with the design solutions already. So they actually appreciate that we did not bring any design in the first meeting. And so with that, building the trust and connection, then we can start the conversations, and it has to start early and often. So we cannot just come into the community say, well, this is it, or even came in with the idea and with already preconceptualized idea and with kind of just having those processes just to do it. We have to have meaningful engagement. And finally, we have to think about this is our duty and to be responsible to the places we are designing for. And I want to acknowledge this takes multiple stakeholders and with multiple students and in this process. And we were able to actually use that project as continuing working with Manoa Heritage Center, Lion Arboretum, and to the University of Hawaii, and to actually looking into how we decolonize education. So we work with school teachers and to think about how they can build into their curriculum to understand the place, sense of place, and in addition to those STEM educations that they are teaching. So in the last session, I want to touch on the climate justice design. And I'm in the process of developing this framework, which I think is important. I think when we talk about justice, we often look at more on the distributive justice, which the classical environmental justice research has been focusing on the patterns, that's more of outcomes. And a lot of people working on the processes as well. So procedural justice, how we engage that process. The ladder of participation is classical reading that's already also been discussed. But I think that the other things we have not fully comprehended or fully implemented in our daily practice is restorational justice. Do we recognize the past harms? And then to think about how we can empower community to move forward, how we can heal the community of the past harm and make them thrive. And whether the transitional justice measure the future investment will not perpetuate injustice. And the generational justice, thinking about sustainability, it's about generational justice, right? What we do today should not compromise for future. And how does this integrate into the design practice? Again, coming from planning and design field, I often think about how this can go back to the practice, how the theory connects to practice with all these processes from the design, development, implementation, evaluation. So one thing I am in the middle of the project is finding the gap between the theory and practice. And so how has justice been addressed in those nature-based solution projects? And I did the pilot study with the American Society of Landscape Architects Environmental Justice Professional Practice Network. and to understand, right, how the practitioners design justice and how do they work with these goals. And so based on that 5 pillars we identified and try to align with what practitioners did, whether they are aligning with those justice goals. And again, what we found is the distributed and procedural justice are more widely kind of being known and probably being done, but they are, transitional general rational justice probably still can be addressed further. And whether their organization actually have justice, these goals in their values and how they think about their actions and whether they have impacts. And a lot of people more think about there's less of making it accountable. There's in the last measurement about how we measure justice. So again, this is just pilot study, and we do want to implement this to a larger network. The Natura network is a nature-based solution for urban resilience. It's a network of networks. So kind of in concluding quickly soon, again, the community climate justice design, the design is about integration of nature science, social science, arts, technology, and working with community together, and to think about how we solve and resolve the wicked problems. So our field is really in the central. The landscape architecture, urban design, environmental design is really the central of this practice. And I think the process should matters most. If the getting people is buying it, and even after you implement it, you have to maintain it, right? And how people use it, and whether the design actually reflect the cultural, the history, and honor that past, and meet the needs of today. It's all have to be done through that process. And we have to understand the systems better, the social, ecological, technological systems, and the thinking you can even combine with, water, food, energy, nexus, all the systems thinking we have to be implemented into the design. And how we communicate the science. The environmental justice research is helpful to, there are many cases because of those type of research, reveal the science and help the community to be empowered to actually make a policy change. So I think this is a critical, and as a scholar, I feel that responsibility of how we communicating better the science to the community. And then how we can reveal the assets. So a lot of time we may think of a vulnerable community is vulnerable, but the vulnerability does not mean resilient. It does not mean the community does not have capacity to cope. So we have to also reveal those positive assets, and again, empower communities to leverage those assets and to advocate their needs and future. And we are all in this system together. So we have to be making ourselves accountable. I think as a landscape architect, seeing those green gentrification projects, I feel I cannot say that I'm not responsible for those displacement of communities anymore. I think we know now there are many consequences. So how can we count ourselves liable for it? And this cannot be done by one single discipline, one single profession. We all have to work together to make it happen. And I hope we can all be an advocate for everything that aligns with our values, whether it's climate change, whether it's justice, environment, conservation, community. I think everybody can play a role and as an advocate. And just a little plug here, the ASOA produced this climate action now, landscape architect's guide to climate advocacy is really laying out what at your individual level, at your how you can play a role. It can be small, can be big, you know, to influence your community, your employer, your policymaker, and how we can scale up that impact. So that's it for my talk today. And thank you very much for your time and listening. And everyone, all our efforts will matter towards a just future. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. I'll give you almost a one-handed applause, single applause. I'm sure everybody feels the same way. We have some questions. I would like to take the opportunity to ask mine. I'm curious about the disagreement with the Army Corps of Engineers and how that ended up, or if the process is still going on. You know, adaptive GI, green infrastructure and nature-based solutions results in adaptive design most of the time. And you can start it slowly and then change it if it's not working. And you don't have to go out and build an entire seawall with all that concrete or build an entire dam with all that concrete. You can adapt slowly. And if it doesn't work, you can go build your dam if it doesn't work. The seawall, I'm not excited about because that ruins the seaside. But so my question is, where does that stand now, and how did that process?
Yeah, the last time, well, it was probably already, you know, before COVID, so it's already 3-4 years ago now. I think at that time, what we heard the last was the federal government, I think, suspended the funding, or they already get the state, but the state suspended the funding to do anything to implement at that moment, because there was a really big protest at that time. So I have not really followed up, to be honest, since then. So I don't know exactly what's the situation today, but yes, it will be interesting to see. I think I have not heard any news coming from Hawaii and to tell me about, you know, any kind of big projects going on. I heard more good news like, oh, the community come together to do something in their community now. And that process, you know, we introduced to them, many other neighborhoods actually want to follow that process in their community. So that's something we were happy to hear about.
Okay, that's great. As an engineer myself, I don't want to say mean things about the Army Corps of Engineers, and they are adapting to a new way of doing things, but they get the money all at once and they have to do something with it. And so then they say, let's build a bunch of concrete, install a bunch of concrete to take care of the problem. So it's actually a problem that they have. Mm-hmm. So Elizabeth, there are many questions here. Elizabeth Hosch asks this question: are there notable differences between the terms nature-based solutions and green infrastructure?
Actually, there's none. I would say it's interesting how those different terms, right? People just invent those terms from now and then. I think to me, green infrastructure is part of a nature-based solution. But I think what the nature-based solution is, I guess, clever about, because now it's become more political phrase per se, is they use this term, right, to emphasize, one is to use ecological, design to restore using the ecological services, basically, right, to address societal issues. And I think that idea is, I'll argue it's from climate change. They have to come back with climate change policies. And this term, I guess, just very neutral, very agreeable. So green infrastructure has been used in the US policy for in the past probably 2-3 decades, 2 decades at least. So I would say it's almost equivalent idea, although I think green infrastructure that EPA is using was a little limited. And in the first, they want to address quality issue. That was their primary concern, but then of course they opened up to other co-benefits. So I think a nature-based solution has a broader net of addressing societal issues in many different ways. So it's not just about stormwater management, right? There's climate change, there's equity, there's urban healing, there's many other things you can think about. They can all be, think about addressed in the nature-based solution based on the definition.
Okay, great. I think that answers the question pretty thoroughly. The next one comes from Sadie, who is with the Minnesota Green Corps. She says, Dr. Cheng, can you tell us a bit more about those initial listening sessions and what questions you ask, if you use any other methods to collect information, and what your goals for the sessions are?
Yes.
Oh my goodness, that's a long question.
Yes, that's a very great question. I'll try to answer it quickly. Is the first session, again, we had a few questions like, oh, where is your favorite places in the park, right? What's your best memory of the park? So again, we want to really try to get stories from the community about the park, about the site, right? Try to understand the place, understand the community there. And so so that's kind of the first session. And then we did a little bit exercise on the drawing board, like oh, we have a base map and overlay with tracing paper, and ask them, oh, where in the park you like it, and your best place, or things like that. We asked a couple kind of prompt questions, but that was really the initial idea. But again, we brought in a few kind of posters with the history of the city, history of the neighborhood, hydrological map and things like we do our homework, right? And actually community also appreciate that. They probably did not know the history because not all of them probably, lived there in the same period of time or know the place. And so they kind of appreciate that part. And in addition that we come here with genuine attitude, want to listen from them, learn from them. I think that's the success of that first session.
That was good. That was brief. Here's a quick question, and this relates to the situation in Minnesota, I think, where we see our playgrounds becoming more and more safe and less fun.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to reach a happy medium. And so the question is, did you have any pushback from the rocks being accessible to young kids in that development?
Yeah, well, recently the founder of the academy told us he did get some pushback from the parents because the kids get hurt, right? Or yes, a little bit, but I think he is able to kind of communicate with them to see, well, it's part of the play in the nature, that I guess that a little injury, not serious injury, just kind of is part of that learning process. And I don't, and eventually I think the parents understand the purpose of, why, you can talk all this, a lot of benefits of getting into the nature, right? Improve your attention, your mental and physical health. And so I think eventually he said he was able to communicate, had a good kind of results after that. But I would say right now we are in the process of writing a proposal in response to LEGO Foundation's the World of Play Challenge. And so we are trying to, in this proposal, I think we will do more of those engaging with different stakeholders, just like you say, right? The parents may think it's not safe, and then that kind of cause the industry too to, you know, put all the safety measures and the regulations and kind of become vicious circle. And then when industry become bigger, they become more voices, etc. And now every place is the same kind of canned playground equipment, and they all have rubber cushion on the bottom, which is toxic and not environmental friend. You know, so it's now a little bit become vicious circle. But there are some hopes in that there are some organizations and groups try to advocate for nature play and to use more natural material, etc. So I think it will be interesting. I guess again we are developing this proposal to see how we can further, pushing this agenda and to have hopefully influence the policies and regulations in the long term.
Okay, thank you. I have another question of mine, and it relates to environmental justice and climate change. Mm-hmm. How do you feel that climate change impacts, that would be extreme storms and droughts, will affect our environmental justice considerations? I mean, will they impact our environmental justice considerations?
Yeah, I would say it is aggravating to the existing systemic vulnerability. So I think the environmental justice does not go away. The systemic injustice did not go away. We have never addressed that, so it's still there. But now we have climate change, actually imposing, additional stresses that is actually aggravating the existing stresses. So flooding become more often or intense. That's where it's already flood prone areas, right? And the heat becomes more. That's already heating the places that's already exposed to the urban heat island effect already, like Phoenix here. We were getting like 100 degrees already, this week. So it's already, aggravating the existing vulnerability. So those people who are already in the vulnerable situation will become even more. And that's the issue of, systemic justice and climate change. And that's why climate justice is actually just revealing even more of those issues from the systemic injustice.
Okay, great. Well, that was fantastic answers, and this is a great topic. We've been trying for a long time to have this topic here. So thank you very much, Chin Win, for being here. We will continue the process with a panel discussion with 3 local experts in the area and Dr. Chin Win Chang, again, answering your questions and talking about their perspective. So please leave for about 5 minutes. We're going to leave for 5 minutes, and then we'll be back with Andy Erickson running a panel on climate change, environmental justice, sustainable development, nature-based solutions. So thank you. Come back in 5 minutes.
Hello and welcome everyone back to the Minnesota Stormwater Seminar Series. My name is Andy Erickson. It is my pleasure and honor to moderate the panel discussion that we will have today with our keynote speaker and our local Minnesota experts on this topic. Again, if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A box. I will be taking questions from there. We will be taking some of the questions left over from the presentation, the keynote presentation. So we will take care of that as well shortly. So I'm going to start by introducing our panel members. Our first panelist is Richard Strong, who is an adjunct assistant professor at the School of Architecture within the College of Design here at the University of Minnesota. So Richard, if you're ready, what is your relation to this topic today?
Hello, I'm an architect and an urban planner, not a landscape architect. So we approach it from more of a building and a site issue. So I teach a course, a master's course in the architectural studios, and how buildings and sites can interrelate to water.
That's excellent. Thank you, Richard. Thanks for being here. Our next panelist is Andrew Novak, who is a landscape restoration specialist at the Washington Conservation District. So Andrew, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to this topic?
My work has pretty much been focused on design, implementation, and management of native plants. I've been in the landscape industry for 25 years. I've worked for nonprofits. I've worked as a gardener. I've owned my own business. I've worked for a watershed district, and now I work for a conservation district. And in all of the various different roles I've had, it seems that issues of sustainability and resilience have been a central theme. And so the newer notion of nature-based solutions and design resonates really well with me, and it reflects what I've learned throughout my career.
That's excellent. Thank you, Andrew, and thanks for being here. And our next panelist is Rich Harrison, who is a registered landscape architect and co-director of design, my apologies, co-director of design at Metro Blooms. So Rich, from your perspective and experience, how do you relate to this topic today? You're on mute, Rich.
I had to be the one to do that. Thank you very much for having me. This is very, very important work that is near and dear to my heart. And at Metro Blooms, a nonprofit Minneapolis, we work on a lot of projects that's related to environmental justice. And some of the concepts that you're talking about hit home. One of them simply that your zip code matters. You mentioned it. It's more than your genetic code. That one I wrote down. I think that's so important. And environmental justice and social justice are deeply intertwined. And we have a lot of similarities here in Minneapolis with major inequities across a lot of different spectrums in North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis, with deep disparities in jobs, housing, healthcare, education, higher incidences of asthma and health problems in communities of color predominantly, and housing and education, and it's all related. So I'm excited about this topic, and I learned I've got a lot more homework to do. You've brought a lot of information to the table, so I'm excited. And I would just also lastly add, talking about white privilege and systemic racism is very difficult. And people get very uncomfortable when we talk about these subjects, but we need to talk more about that. And so I'm really excited to be part of that process. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Rich. And I'm not going to ask for Dr. Cheng's relation, but I am going to dive right into a very popular question that came in during her presentation. And I'm really interested not only in her response, but all of our panelists' responses. And the question is, first, can you talk more about how long it took you to connect before starting collaboration and what that looked like? So for the panelists, Dr. Cheng talked about a specific example or a few examples, but I also want the panelists to think about projects and interactions and how they've tackled that as well. So Dr. Cheng, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think this really depends on the project and how you were entered that project, right? So we are fortunate, actually I knew that we have to find a local stakeholders before we can do any project in Hawaii. And so our initial contact was Hawaii Green Growth, which is a local NGO there. So it's really through their help to connect us, right, with the local community, so that we can do this project in 1 semester, in 1 year. Otherwise, I think it really depends on the community. There's no rules really, but only rule is you have to get their trust. You need to get their buy-in before you can start proposing anything. That's the only kind of principle I would say.
So maybe before I turn to the panelists, maybe I'll add to that. So how do you initiate that? How do you introduce yourself to the community? How do you gain that trust? How do you better connect or create these conversations and activities? So please, panelists, dive in.
I'll start. And, you know, we start also, it's that gaining of the trust and buy-in is so critical. And that's in the very, very beginning. We've developed a participatory landscape design process with environmental justice communities. And we all started our work on an affordable housing complex, 17 acres site up in Brooklyn Park. And we started by hosting community meetings with the management owners of the property. And we invited all the stakeholders, including those residents who rent at that complex. And they may not have had the best relationship with management at that time. And so we've been working there now for 5 years. And I don't know for sure, but I think it might have the largest number of rain gardens on an affordable housing complex in the country. Who knows? I can't compare to others, but there's 17 of them. And we co-created those spaces with them and allowed them to give them the agency to make decisions at the table right in the beginning. And that automatically allowed them to have some buy-in and make some decisions. And these are renters. And so I'd never experienced anything like this before. And it's amazing. It's amazing work.
It's interesting. Yeah, your experience with those projects in North Minneapolis is really fantastic, Rich. So in my work, it's been a little different. It seems like most of the work I'm doing, I'm responding to requests to meet with people. It's a real common thing here. We have, you know, somebody sends in a request to our agency interested in this, getting information. And so we'll respond to these site visit requests and we'll go and meet with people. The problem that I'm seeing is the people who are requesting are always requesting from almost, I don't know how else to put it, but almost from a place of maybe privilege. Maybe it's word of mouth. It seems like we're always responding to people with very similar education background, very similar income, very similar zip codes, with very similar likes and dislikes. And we're not always reaching audiences that we're hoping to actually target. You know, internally as an organization, we want to be addressing issues of equity in our work. And so what, you know, we're asking ourselves is how do we go about engaging with communities that aren't reaching out to us, but we need to maybe be more proactive. And I've had opportunities to do that, where it's like we've been in our organizations, we've been incorporating layers of underserved communities into our GIS work, into how we target water quality practices and environmental practices. We still have a ton of work to do in this, but what it's doing is it's helping us to shift our focus to be less of a, you know, responding to the constituency and more toward proactively going out and trying to meet people where they are. And so the idea of community engagement that begins very early, it resonates with me. It's like we almost have to go there and meet people where they are and engage with them and listen. I did have a really great project that I was working on where, you know, somebody came to us we sat down, we had a meeting, and we just built a relationship together where it's like, you know, he lives in an area of St. Paul where he's trying to deal with trauma and violence and crime. And I'm trying to figure out how can we meet these people in this community more in a more meaningful way, in a more, you know, proactive way. So.
Yeah. Oh, from the academic perspective in teaching, when you deal with sustainability, which I've been dealing with for the last 30 years, it's kind of interesting. It's about balance, isn't it? But it's about rebalancing, because the environmental, social aspects haven't been as much as the economics. So when you're rebalancing, you become change agents, because you're out there trying to change what is out there right now. And as a result of a change agent, you automatically get into the community and try to make things different and more of a future rather than a present. So I always emphasize my students, I always put the charge on them that they will become change agents if they choose to stay in sustainability.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment. Go ahead.
It seemed like when you were talking about change agency too, Richard, like I was thinking about how we have to look at we've had to look at how we fund projects. It seems like a lot of the water quality projects that we're getting in the ground that are successful have a huge funding component. And we have to figure out, you know, how is that funding mechanism geared more towards a certain demographic, a certain population, and how can we internally look at our policies, practices, and procedures to change how we fund projects. And we, you know, some of what we were working on really challenged the way that we normally thought we should be spending our money. It's like we're always focused on removal of phosphorus. You know, it's just like the central theme. And so we've had to look at, well, maybe removal of phosphorus is really great, but maybe we need to think about, you know, like locations, the types of communities that we might be able to engage, some of those other facets that can kind of open up these funding mechanisms that we have.
Yep, I'd like to just continue that, Andy, what you're saying. It's our funding partners have responded to this, you know, the watershed districts, the counties. You know, 5 years ago, you know, when we worked together, Andy, you know, environmental justice wasn't even really talked about in my, you know,
it was just starting.
It was just starting. That's when we started about 5 years ago. And now it's a huge component to prioritizing where public funds are going into improving water quality, into improving the outdoor spaces that have been disinvested so much in the past. And so, you know, back to the first question, it's like taking the time to connect with people and taking time to genuinely listen. And that's one of the barriers, is time. Because traditionally these projects have been, you know, we have timelines that we have to spend this money by. And, you know, now it's like, you know, coming out of a pandemic, hopefully we're on the tail end of it. But it's just been that's been a really big challenge, is taking the time to genuinely listen, to understand where people's, you know, where they've come from, and the challenges that they have in their lives. And a lot of times it might not align with the same goals traditionally as these other projects had, you know, removing phosphorus and that. But once you realize, you know, we talk about traditional ecological knowledge and environmental literacy and learning how much we've been deprived of nature too, and how it impacts our behavior and our well-being. It's really exciting to find common ground, and you can find it anywhere when you talk to people. So.
I guess on that note, what other lessons have we learned? Like, what other ways have worked well with connecting? You know, Andrew was talking about, you know, maybe we need to rethink how proactive we are and how we reach out to certain groups and certain communities and certain zip codes or areas. What other ways have been successful in starting those conversations, getting people to come to listening sessions, right? Because that can be hard. You advertise and nobody shows up. So what are some of the things that are working well or that you've seen worked well that maybe our audience could use in their spaces?
Well, I think probably it has to go back to going into the communities. So really go to their church group, go to their farmers market, go to really the schools. It is a lot of time they were prohibited, from their work schedule at cost, etc., or child care, to be able to go to those public meetings. And I agree, those people who are able to go or voice are usually probably the same people. Yes, that's what we have experienced here too.
I think another key issue is talk about them. Don't talk about you. And one thing Xiuming talked about is bringing maps of the community and establishing, is this really what you view the community to be like? I did a lot of community planning and sustainable planning. And so we brought up issues that we think are important, but are they in fact what you think is important? And data and information that we've collected that they look at and they say, I agree with that, or I do not agree with that. That's perceived, or is that real? And then trying to build that value system.
I want to say one word. It's almost lunchtime, but food, right? Breaking bread, is important. We're eating together. You can talk about your relationship with food, and actually food security is another issue in communities. So I think, including that component is a good thing to bring people together in the communities that we work in. That those are often the most successful meetings, and starting with food.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So, so maybe the next question kind of leads to what other, so that's talking about actions that we can do, right? We can, as groups or individuals, we can try to reach out to these communities in ways that we can get people to the table, right? From across the spectrum. Is there, and I don't know if anybody has ideas on this, and this is coming in again from our audience here, is there more of a policy or systemic way that we can also encourage or even implement, change the way we do things? And specifically the question is, could an example be changing the zoning requirements within municipalities so that the requirements for stormwater management or green infrastructure or nature-based solutions are even more required in certain zip codes or certain areas or certain underserved communities? Could that be another way from the top down that we can make change and be good change agents? I don't know if anybody has comments or other ideas like that could work in these ways as well.
I think, from the planning perspective, we can use like overlay zoning, right? Practices. We can identify the areas that we can call it climate justice zone. Right, we can start prioritizing those strategies and work with people. So, and then you need incentives too. You have to work developers and work with all the agencies. So make sure they are all part of the conversation too.
Yeah, I agree. I think just holding our cities and developers accountable, and investing equally. This gets into equity, and I see so many infrastructure failings in what we would call rough parts of the town, and sidewalks that are broken, damaged, which has to do with accessibility. I remember when they were redoing Lake Street a long time ago, redoing the streetscaping, and the last part to be done was at 35W in that intersection down there. And I understand now why that was the last one to be improved, because they're redoing the bridge. But I kind of was thinking to myself way back, why couldn't have they done that first? Or at least done something to improve that area? Obviously, it's going to get redone again in like 5 to 10 years later. But why are they always the last environmental justice neighborhoods, the ones to get invested in last? And we need to change that.
Yeah, I think accountability is key, and you know, we need to just be, you know, holding true to what we have obviously internalized on a very spiritual, emotional, and personal levels. These concepts of sustainability and resiliency, you know, hold true to ourselves and be courageous advocates, like you were talking about, Richard. You know, just being proactive and just doing the good work. And you know, there's not a lot of work that's going to get done with blaming. It's more of those strategic conversations that we need to have. And I think that, you know, it's those strategic conversations, but then also like what you were saying, Chuen, about you know, policy, and I think there's a balance there. So you know, as we get more engaged in our work, you know, we're kind of bridging gaps between decision makers and constituencies.
So I want to dive into, so I talked about actions, we talked about even policy and maybe top-down approaches. I want to dive a little bit into communication and reaching people and even definitions and understandings. And this is a great question. Ross Bintner submitted this one, and it goes back to this maybe confusion around nature-based design versus green infrastructure. And Ross's question is saying, you know, he's noticed that these terms can be confusing to the public about what is infrastructure, right? Which is what maybe municipalities and state agencies and other entities are required to maintain. It's our duty to maintain that infrastructure, versus what is nature, which is more of our duty to protect and enhance and restore, right? Do we need to define these things, you know, differently and better for the public? Or should we blur those lines a little bit more so that we are doing more of both all the time? So what would you say to that?
I think we have been blurring in our practice and for quite some time now. Because I think if you think about everything we designed, our street, neighborhoods, our cities, our national park, we designed too. So nothing is really natural truly about it, because there's people manage it. People design it. Even I often say to students, no design is design too. Okay, so we don't have to think we have to do something, but actually that is also design, right? So it is definitely because people are we are part of the environment, and we shape us. So it's really hard to say what is the line there, and I don't think we should define that either.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I'm always encountering this idea of maintenance, you know, that's like the big deal when we're talking about primarily like stormwater infrastructure or restoration plantings. It's, you know, this framing it from this perspective of maintenance. And I've always tried to advocate more for, you know, maybe it's not maintenance, maybe it's gardening, maybe it's stewardship. Maybe we play around with the words that we use to try to tell a story. And so, you know, I mean, if I go to someone's property and I'm walking through with them and I start using acronyms like BMP, you know, and talking about hydrological models, I mean, I'm going to lose them. So if it's just a natural part of my work is how am I going to communicate more effectively? And I think that focus always ends up being a more successful avenue. So it's kind of, you know, like, yeah, it's blurring, but it's also, you know, adapting to the situation. I mean, there's that concept of resiliency again, is how do we manage ourselves in a resilient way?
Yeah, the words we use is really important. And in that topic, we are trying to use the word land care for maintenance as much as possible. And we talk about that in our sustainable land care services that we provide. And also we have a sustainable land care training program because, you know, one of the weaknesses in this whole topic is a knowledgeable workforce. And, you know, I completely agree with you in the fact that, yeah, we need to, it's blurred for me. And I would go as far as saying rewilding. That's another big topic. And, you know, the way that we've developed a landscape in the past is completely unhealthy for us humans and all living beings. And so it's really critical to change our mindset. And, you know, it's also like that engineering mindset in the past, which has been a watershed mentality and shed that water away as quickly as possible. Where I talk about catchments and subcatchments. And I've heard this, you know, terminology used in the past with other engineers now. And it's like, we want to capture that stormwater as close to the source as possible and integrate green infrastructure, vegetated solutions using native plants that have co-evolved with insects and wildlife in the regions in which that we're working in. And explaining this early on in the process and this whole relationship that we so desperately need and have been deprived of in the past is so critical. And this is a human health issue, is what it is, you know. And as our infrastructure fails, which is continuously happening because it was designed in a whole different manner, we need to be replacing it everywhere, on private property, public parks, everywhere, wherever it's possible. And that gets back to policy, and that needs to be part of the policy as well, zoning and requirements for all agencies.
I would just interject between gray and green infrastructure. Why don't you just say all infrastructure has to be kind of adaptive or resilient, self-learning, self-organizing, just make that the overall objective. And whether it's green or gray, it doesn't make any difference. We just need to be have better infrastructure that responds to the needs that we have.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I love that distinction that you made, Rich, between watershed versus catchment, right? You know, oftentimes we just use the words and don't even think about them and what they mean and even what they connotate. So, and Richard, with that gray versus green, it's all infrastructure, right? And we have to manage and maintain all of it. So I think that's great. I actually want to dive into even a little more into that and think about what are ways that we can communicate that better and engage people, get people excited about it. So, you know, Andrew, you're talking about the words that we use. You're going to lose people if you're not communicating in their languages. I'm thinking about, you know, how do we get people, again, as we said earlier, their goals, everybody's goals are different, right? And in the neighborhoods, they have a goal and they're not maybe thinking about the water, you know, and maybe they don't even care about the water because they don't have water. So what are some ways that we can communicate better, get engagement better, and get people on board and excited about some of these things? Do we just have to build it and then let them see what it is? Or can we get them involved on the front end? What would you say to that?
I would say first, we do our homework too, right? So if we talk to the farmers, right, we have to understand what kind of issues and concerns they may have. Let's say water, right? If we talk to farmers, don't need to talk about water security, energy security, right? And then how does that relate to climate change? You don't have to even talk about climate change, but just to say how, well, especially in some places, you may even you may not even allowed to talk to use that word. And then you will probably talk about extreme weathers, how that change the pattern for cultivations, and what's the what's the impact on pesticides to water quality, and how does that relate to food production. So I guess you have to find ways to relate to people, no matter who you are talking to, find ways really to link that issues, what we want to address, but in a way they can really relate to.
I think it's interesting how there's been several movements that have all kind of surfaced around different issues, but they've all kind of found similar ground. And what I'm talking about is like pollinator habitat is a big thing for some people. Invasive species, buckthorn is a big thing for some people. Water quality, rain gardens was a big thing for some people. And it seems like all of those three divergent issues have all kind of coalesced around a central theme, and that is a resilient, functioning landscape. And people have come at it from different interest levels. I think what you're trying to get us to think about, Andy, is what are some other things that we can use to bring people in? And I don't have an answer for it right this second, but I'll keep thinking about that.
That's okay. We're all a work in progress, right? We're all trying to.
But it does show how it does show how those things kind of can tie together, and different interests can all find a home in these ideas.
Yeah. I find it's pretty easy to connect with people at different once you start talking about these issues, a lot of times we're brought into affordable housing project because there's issues with, water damage, or, the quality of the outdoor spaces are poor, and our partners have brought us in and to talk about these things. And once you start talking and, storytelling and listening, when I give a presentation on, Stormwater 101, I'll just say, and one of the barriers has been language. We work in communities where English is not the first language spoken. And I've given presentations where it's been translated in Oromo and Somali and Spanish and lots of different languages. And you start talking about even the first flush of stormwater, when the rain hits the surface and that first flush is the most polluted. And people light up when they finally understand what you're talking about and how you can capture it. And we start talking about bees and pollinator habitat and how important that is to our food security, right? 1/3 food that we eat is because of native bees and honeybees too. But and the beauty that comes in with nature, and you start talking about storytelling, and I get into photography and I'll talk about that. I'll even have a photo contest, take some macro pictures. These devices that we have are amazing, and you can go in there and take pictures and share that with people, and have others share it with their friends. And it just opens up the floodgates of connecting people at all different levels. It's exciting.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's interesting, Richard. I actually, to introduce a topic, I had people have cameras. This is when there was cameras, and they went out and took photos, and then we just lined them all up. What's the most important? What's the value that you value? And it was interesting how this was on a college campus, how the faculty, staff, and students really viewed it very differently, and what they thought the essential values were.
That actually could be, I would think, I don't know if maybe somebody's done this already, but take pictures around neighborhoods and put them up on a board and have the community put value on each of those, right? And really that might be a good way to illustrate what are the neighborhood values, right? What do they put a lot of stock in? What's important to them, and maybe what's not so important to them? That could be really interesting.
we're
Yeah.
we're emotional beings,
Yeah.
right? And that's the best way to connect, is when you start talking about our feelings, which a lot of times we've suppressed in the past
Mhm.
for some reason, cultural reasons. And the more we talk about that, the more engaged we become. And so.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
and
Andrew. Oh yeah.
Sorry, I just want to share, like in Hawaiian culture, they actually like to start a conversation with commonality, to find a commonality together. And they are not shy asking about where are you from, you know, and they want to find that same, and then they will start to quickly connect. I think, so the common, I think, I like Andrew's point about what, you know, what's the common ground? And you think about back, how does sustainability, this term that the sustainable development started, become more popular term, is our common future, that book, right, that publication. So that's really the idea of, okay, all these challenges now, what is the common, like we have a common goal together, right? We have to work towards it.
Yeah, were you going to say something else, Andrew? I don't know if we cut you
No,
off.
I was just agreeing with Richard.
Okay, excellent. I do want to make a note. One of the questions that came into the Q&A is actually more of a comment. Thank you all so much for this thought-provoking and informative presentation. Thanks, Cheng-Wen, for setting the stage with that keynote, and thanks, panelists. We're going to keep going with questions, but I just wanted to interject that we are getting some positive feedback from our audience. So thank you for contributing to that. But the next question maybe is getting into maybe how we think about it. And it gets back to something that Andrew talked about. How do we select our communities? What's going into our decision-making currently about, where do we want to put things? Where do we want to spend money, right? That came up. How did we get funding and we have to implement practices? How do we decide where to do that? How do we pick? And maybe some of the old ways through modeling and other things that we've done as engineers and landscape urban planners are not the best tools. So what are some other ways that maybe you are using to select where projects go in, or maybe even take it out of your own decision-making hands and maybe empower others to help you make those decisions about where things are going? You know, Cheng-Wen, you talked about how property owners are helping with making decisions about what goes in, but maybe even before that, how do we select where we're doing things? So I don't know if you have comments on that, all of you.
You know, there is a practice called participatory budgeting. Have you heard about this practice? I think it's not very commonly implemented in the US. I think Phoenix maybe started at 2 years ago. I saw a brochure and say, oh yeah, you want to come to this meeting to talk about budget. So I think that's a good starting point, right? So if we can have that kind of transparency to start, and to be able to reach out to communities, say, how would you like to spend this budget, right? So it takes the institutional kind of change in the system to see how we can actually allow that to happen.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
The city of Minneapolis has, it's been a while now since they implemented their green zones areas. And these are communities where they focus more economic development in those vulnerable communities. You know, they're lower income communities, indigenous communities, communities of color. I'm just actually looking at the website right now and I'm reading it. You know, it's Minneapolis experienced unequal wealth, health, employment, education outcomes, and are overburdened by environmental conditions such as traffic, pollution sources, brownfield sites, blight. This is all the things that you've been talking about in your presentation. So money is being funneled into these communities now. So it's like an overlay district, like you were talking about with zoning, and now prioritizing improvements and funding in these communities, because these communities are suffering, and it's not to any fault of those that live there, and we need to all come together, work with everybody to improve that quality of life. So.
Yeah, I mentioned incorporating various different types of data into GIS layers when we're kind of doing our sub-watershed analyses and our prioritization efforts. We had some really great work done in the area, the Twin Cities. We have a data layer that very clearly delineates underserved communities, and we could simply overlay that layer into our GIS work where we're looking at our grant program, and we could see where there was alignment, like where are we not reaching people and where are these underserved communities, and then we could start to develop outreach strategies from there. But that's just on a smaller level. Sure.
Well, I can certainly see if the process is an application-based process and underserved communities are not even aware of it, right? Then systemically, they're not going to put in applications and things aren't going to go in. So, yeah. And
that was part of the question, and part of where we wanted to focus the solution is, why aren't we reaching these people? And we knew when we did the overlay, we knew kind of what we were going to find, and it lined up with what we found. But yeah, it's like that was the decision then to just start being more proactive with outreach.
Yep. An example of a granting agency, the Board of Soil Water Resources, who has provided funding for the Lawns to Legumes program, which is to provide habitat for the rusty patch bumblebee, our endangered species, and state bee. They've added that to the program last year. And there's demonstration neighborhood projects that are focusing a lot on environmental justice communities and investing the funding in those communities. So that's a good example. And they use GIS, of course, to define those geographically. So it's great.
Well, before we go to the close, I want to ask one more question that kind of takes it to the other end. So we were just talking about how do we make decisions on the front end and where we want to do more implementation. And now, and this does go back to something we've talked about before, but now on the other side, once we've made some decisions and we get to maybe that public comment period, right? Or some of these other ends of the projects, is there something there that is a barrier for some communities? Right? Whether it's a 30, a 60, a 90-day public comment period, it's even in those types of characteristics of these programs, do we need to make changes there? Because that's also, Chengwen, you mentioned childcare. You got to reach the people where they are, and they have to be available to go to these things. And if you schedule something where people can't go, and maybe even culturally within a neighborhood, right? Certain times of the day are just they're not going to be there, right? So are there things that we've learned, lessons we've learned on that side of it, on the public engagement side, on the back end, to be able to get approval, to get support, to build more engagement? Are there some things there, again, systemically, that are causing barriers or creating barriers? And have you overcome any of those in any ways?
I'll give an example. I did some community planning in South Minneapolis. And it turned out one community we were planning in, they liked the written word. If it was written, it was more believable. So we did little vignettes and sent out magazines. We worked in another neighborhood that their radio program that people listen to, where they believe that over the written word. So the type of communication you need to do is what they believe is credible, I guess. So we did radio programs on this one local radio program, and we talked about the issues and things like that, and we got people to meetings that way.
Richard, how did you find out about that? How did you learn that those were the methods of communication that people found credible?
Well, when you initially get into the communities, you start talking about what do you believe? Where do you get your information from? And things like that. And how just talking to various people. And you learn it very quickly where sources of power are and where people believe it's credible.
The key is it always takes time to do that extra relationship building. You know, it's an easy thing to cut from a budget, you know, and if you're not prioritizing it and these other, lip service type methods have worked for organizations in the past, let's just do the same old status quo, call it community engagement and move on. And I've seen plenty of that. And so, Richard, when you're delving into a community or when you're delving into a community, it's like go to the neighborhood association meetings, go to the friends groups, go to the native plant group and just get to know people. And you'd be surprised at how, you can just by word of mouth, you can find connections. Every time I've engaged that way, I've met more people that way through word of mouth than any other way, and I was able to, be more effective.
Yeah, I would say in person is by far the best. This pandemic has definitely challenged us to reinvent ourselves, to communicate through digital means, but a lot of people don't have access to a computer. And so door knocking, getting out into the community, exactly, meeting people where they're at. And then once we're able to organize, I wanted to mention one of the tools that we use at Metro Blooms, and that's guiding principles. And Richard, you mentioned written word up, and we actually post these at meetings where, this is all under the values of equity and inclusion to solve these environmental challenges. And then not only do we post them, but we say them together. It's kind of weird at first. It almost feels like you're at church saying a prayer or something. But, we all, like the first one and a list, we agree that we cannot do impactful environmental work without meaningful involvement of residents. And that so we come to these agreements so that everyone's on the same page up front. Another one is we are committed to practicing ecological design in the creation of more livable outdoor spaces. So we make it clear that, we're not there to talk about your washing machine that's broken or some of the interior issues that might, be happening in apartment complexes, elevators and such. We're talking about outdoor spaces. And it prefaces that so that it is focused on that. And then also including everybody early, again, as soon as possible is critical, and allowing them to, people to have a voice, the stakeholders to have a voice early on and shaping these agreements. So that's been very successful for us.
I will add to finding the local champion and alliance as well.
Yes.
So, and I will also count and make our constituency accountable, right? Those representatives, if it's representing the community, representing that district, then they should also be held accountable as well.
I think it's good to work through, like Andrew said, groups that are already formed, but make sure you have everybody at the table. Who's missing? Who's missing in that group?
Wow, it feels like we're already covering our key takeaways. We're diving right in. So why don't we do that? If there's any other key takeaways, let's do that now. And so that's what I want is for each panelist to just take a couple moments and just, what's your big aha moments from today's discussion? What do you want to make sure that resonates with the audience as we leave? And again, I'll go in the same order that I introduced everyone. So Richard, why don't you go ahead with, if you have any other key takeaways you want to add before we close?
I'll make one comment more takeaways. I think it's all been good. I think what is interesting, I've been involved in sustainability for about 30 years now. And I've noticed, where sustainability was about balancing, and of course there was always kind of pushback against the balance and how that was. And now we're going to resiliency as these climate change issues have starting to impact our infrastructure and our capitalism and everything else. All of a sudden it's about resiliency. It seems like it's pushing back. We got to hold back this, and so resiliency becomes a big issue. But I think really it's sustainability of all. I mean, not just us, but certainly nature sustaining us is a much more comprehensive view of it.
That's great, Richard. Andrew, what would you say is your key takeaways, closing thoughts?
I think the whole panel discussion and the work that you presented, Ching-Wen, has been really great at illustrating the importance of the human, social, cultural element in green infrastructure and how it's just such a key component. I'm thinking about just how successful our projects have been and the work that we need to do, and it keeps tying back to simple decision-making policies where, a storm sewer system permit requires community engagement. And what has that meant for us? It's like we wouldn't be here if we didn't have those types of policy pieces in play. And it stems back to what you were talking about, Richard. The sustainability trifecta is the social, and it is how we interact with the ecological and the economic that is very important. And I think that our work here to date is showing some great successful work in that. It's illustrating very clearly that we need to do more, and that it's a win for people who are focusing on how do we bring communities into the fold.
That's great, Andrew. Rich, what would you add as closing thoughts, key takeaways?
Well, I have to just commend you on all of your hard work that you've told us today, and I appreciate all of that. ASLA is benefiting from your research and all of us practitioners that are on this call. I think the biggest thing I just keep on coming back to is taking the time and prioritizing funding for this process. And the more that we can connect with individuals, stakeholders in our communities, the better off we're all going to be. The more resilient our community is. We talk about resilience in terms of biodiversity and vegetation and redundancy and stormwater management systems, but ultimately this is a human, issue, a human health issue. And so the sooner we can engage and the more we can connect with one another through storytelling and finding commonality, then we're going to be a much more resilient community all in all. And hopefully we can overcome some of these systemic racism issues that exist. I can't believe that it's so prevalent. And the more I learn about it, the more prevalent I find it to be. And it's kind of a scary time in a way, but it's an exciting time too, because we know that we can overcome these barriers and we can improve the quality of our health all at the same time, improve water quality, improve habitat, and improve our relationships with one another across all parts of our communities. So it is an exciting time. And so thank you very much for letting me be part of this.
Thanks, Rich. Those are great words. And now for the closing, the last word, as we say, Dr. Cheng, what would you say is your key takeaways and closing thoughts?
Starting with closing thoughts, I think one thing I actually do like to add to the concept of resilience is the capacity to cope with change.
Yeah.
So thinking that capacity is from the social, ecological, technological systems. And that connects with sustainability, because in order for us to sustain, we also need to be able to have the capacity to cope.
Yeah.
And also think a more transformative resilience. So that coping capacity, not only to let us to withstand where we are now, but thinking about how we can face the future challenges and injustice, climate change, all the challenges. So how can we build that capacity together, whether it's from ecosystem capacity, from social capacity, economic capacity, race capacity, everything together to move us forward to a better, sustainable, resilient, just futures.
Those are great. Thank you so much, Dr. Cheng, for giving us our keynote and setting the topic for today. Thank you, panelists, Richard, Andrew, and Rich, for serving as local experts for our audience. And I want to thank you, the audience, for attending and joining us today. Thank you for your questions. I apologize that we couldn't get to them all. We will share them with the panelists and the speakers so they can provide some additional responses, and we'll share that out by email afterwards. I encourage you to, if this was informational and you enjoyed it, please join us again for a future Minnesota Stormwater Seminar series. I also dropped a link in the chat for a short feedback survey. We'd love to hear your opinions and ways that we can improve, and potentially other speakers that we could invite to this Minnesota Stormwater Seminar series. So with that, I hope to see you at a future Minnesota Stormwater Seminar series. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.